30 years now. But we can, I think, move to the talk, and the title is on the imperative and the optative in Old Japanese. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will stand up, and as you'll notice when you look at the slide, I've modified the title a little bit by adding the prohibitive into the mix. How do I actually change slides on this? So I will be talking about these three forms that make up a very distinct sentence type or mood. Okay. Okay. Except the arrows are not working. Oops. Okay.
I think these ones. Yeah.
So these ones. Okay. Sorry about that. Japanese has Old Japanese rather. So I'll tell you what I'll be talking about. But first of all, I wanted to introduce these three forms that are morphologically distinct forms in Old Japanese, called conventionally imperative, prohibitive, and optative. And they, I'm not going to read out all the examples, but they mean things like cut the grass, don't step on the snow, or I wish the cuckoo would sing. And those are the three forms I'll be talking about. I will not be talking about how to say things in Old Japanese. I will talk about how these forms are used and what they mean and what they are. But of course, with these kinds of meanings, you can express, I guess, in all languages, you can express them in a variety of ways. But this is forms that morphologically encode these meanings, and that's all they do. This is the structure of the talk. I'll first give a little bit of background on Old Japanese. Then I will give an overview introduction of the three forms, and then I'll talk about them individually, and then try to say something in the summary that sort of ties it all together. Old Japanese is, these are the sort of conventional periods of the Japanese language. Old Japanese is the language of the 8th century, which these periods are, for anyone who knows anything about Japanese history, it'll be very clear that they are mapped closely onto political historical periods. They also make a lot of sense in terms of the language, of the history of the language, but of course you can periodicize language histories in various ways depending on what criteria you use, but this is the conventional one. So Old Japanese, 8th century Japanese, most sources reflect the language of the center of government, the capital Nara, which is around the Kyoto, Osaka area, for those who know Japan. Later, the capital moved to Tokyo, but this is what's reflected in these sources. There's a little bit of material also showing Eastern dialects, which are referred to collectively as Eastern Old Japanese. I won't really get into that. All sources are written in Chinese characters. There was no independent Japanese script evolved at that time yet. These characters were used both logographically, so used to write words, or phonographically used just to write sound. This means that sometimes the interpretation of the text is not entirely uncontroversial or straightforward. Majority of sources from the period are poetry, which, well, I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but just first, the total volume of text is around 110,000 words. So it's not a very large amount of text. It's sort of like a thin paperback. But it's enough for us to, I think, very clearly understand the phonology, morphology, and morphophonology, and also some of the syntax, but I think there's still a lot of the syntax that hasn't really been fleshed out in great detail, and there's some of it we will never be able to capture because of the limitations of the material. Old Japanese is like modern Japanese, usually thought to be a typical SOV of a final language, and it, for example, has left branching and head final modifying structures, postpositional case particles and other particles, and that kind of thing that many syntacticians associate with SOV languages. It also, though, has, despite being verb final, frequent right dislocations, so actually things occurring after the verb. They're usually thought to be right dislocated and a variation on the main word order. But there are things that we'll see in the course of this talk. The main issues for studying the grammar of Old Japanese, other than it being a dead language with no native speakers, which means that we can't check anything, we have to rely on our interpretation of the texts. The quantity of material, so it's not a huge amount of material. The quality of the material, it's a limited range of text genres, which means that there are things we will never have documentation of or for. There's a lot of repetition in the text as well, which means that although we have 110,000 words, some of it is just different instantiations of the same sentences or even longer stretches of text. The mixture I mentioned of logographic and phonographic writing is also something that makes it difficult to study the language. On poetry, the poetry has some metrical constraints, which are quite sort of firmly defined and usually followed quite strictly, which can have an influence on how long the sentence you make can be, for example. In this particular case, with the kind of forms that I'll be talking about, I think the fact that it's poetry is actually an advantage. If we had large volume of very boring law text, for example, we'd never come across, or very rarely come across, prohibitive. Well, you might come across prohibitives, of course, in certain types of legal texts, but I doubt we'd come across a lot of optatives, for example, or imperatives. And so the fact that this is very interpersonal, clearly interpersonal, and somewhat emotive text actually is an advantage for these kinds of forms, I think. Accessibility of material, you just have to spend a very long time studying this, which makes it a long-term project. Until recently, the texts were available of course, in printed form, but they were actually not easy to, of course, they were easy to access in the sense you could go to the library, take out all the books and then open them in front of you. But more recently, we've developed this, which Lutz mentioned, the Oxford Ninja Corpus of Old Japanese, which is based mainly in Oxford, but we're collaborating with the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics, which is abbreviated NINJAO, so that's why it's called the Oxford Ninja Corpus of Old Japanese. And now also some collaboration with Hirosaki University in northern Japan. This is a corpus that consists of, at the moment, not all, but ultimately all of the text from the period and all the poetic text from the period. It is comprehensively annotated for syntactic parsing, morphology, mode of writing, and all the kind of things you need to know about a text in order to study it. It's associated with an Old Japanese to English dictionary, which is still in a rudimentary stage. All of this is still being developed, but it is now in a form that you can actually use it very well. And it also has translations of the texts at the moment. A little bit more than 1/3 of all the texts have translations published next to them, but the goal is, of course, to get all the text translated into English. And that's the resource I've used for preparing the talk today. It's also a resource that can be used for studying many aspects of Old Japanese. And it is a way into the text that means you don't have to spend 15, 20 years training as a Japanese philologist before you can start working on the language. And we see already young people from very different backgrounds, but with an interest in the oldest Japanese, approaching the material now. And as you can imagine, they come up with ideas that you don't get if you spend 15 years learning the traditional approach to studying the text and what's in the text. And that's, I think, very refreshing to see. So I'll go on to introducing these three forms, or actually, as we'll see, sets of forms now. These are two examples of imperative forms. I've included here the, okay, I don't want to turn this off again. How did I use the pointer? The very bottom where it's the one that says menu? No? Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, right, that one. Okay, yeah. So I've included just here on this slide the original script, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. As you can see, both of these examples are written as are all the texts in Chinese characters. And what they mean is lend me a boat, so an imperative out here. I've tried to put all the imperatives in red so they're easy to spot, and then bold them in the translations just to make it easy, because I suspect nobody here knows a lot of Japanese. This text here is written such that each character is used phonographically to write a syllable. So this one means na, this one means wo, no, etc. So if you were a reader of Chinese, for example, this would make absolutely no sense to you. And you would not be able to read the sounds either, because the sound values that the characters are used for were derived from early Middle Chinese, or something maybe slightly prior to early Middle Chinese, which is Chinese around 600 AD. And of course, Chinese pronunciation has changed since. This example here has almost all the characters used logographically, except I think these last two here. And so if you were a reader of Chinese, you'd be able to make sense of at least each character. But of course, the syntax is very different, the morphology is very different, but you'd be able to get a sense of what it means, because this use of Chinese characters was based on translation from Chinese into Japanese. And when you've done that for a while, you can then reverse that process to write the Japanese. And that's how they came up with the idea of writing in the first place. But I will not include anything of the writing in the following slides. So this is just an example of two, oops, sorry. Will it come back? Okay, I'll try to keep my finger on the right button. So that will go away, okay, that's good. So kase here, lend, in the imperative form, very straightforward. Here we have the form to come, ko, and something we'll see several times, a right dislocator, post addressee for the imperative. Prohibitive is in notionally, of course, a negative imperative, a command not to do something, and that's what's shown in these two examples. There are two different ways of showing the prohibitive. One is, I'll talk about the forms in a little bit, but you can see it's different. Na, kise, so, and then shimesu, na. They look morphologically different, right? And I'll explain that in a second. But these are typical uses. These are some typical uses, but I think if you, at least that's what I discovered when I started thinking about this. If you think about the difference between how imperatives and prohibitives are used, you actually use them quite differently. You prohibit quite different things that you normally wouldn't command in a non-negative context. And then finally, there are three different optative forms, one that ends in na, one in ne, and one in namu, and they mean slightly different things, and I'll talk more about that later. But here, I wish I too would get wet. This verb form, nude na, get wet in the optative form. May you spend, kudasane, may you spend today merrily, my fine friends. And then finally, this one, I wish my beloved were garment, which is, then I could wear her and have her with me all the time. So these are the three kinds of forms: imperative, prohibitive, and optative, that I'll be trying to sort of go into in more detail. This chart shows several things. It shows the Old Japanese, which has these forms. The imperative doesn't show any variation in form. The prohibitive has three different forms with a pre-post negation na, then either followed by the verb on its own, as here, or followed by the verb and then something that's usually considered a particle so, which can also have the form sone. This so is, I think, quite clearly a fossilized imperative of the verb to do. So it's a kind of do support for this. There's another very way of doing this, which has the na after the verb. And I'll get to that in a second. And then there are the optative forms. The chart also shows the forms that continued in early Middle Japanese, so 8th to 12th century, 9th to 12th century. And we see that there's a reduction in the variability, both for the prohibitives and for the optatives. And then finally, when we get to modern Japanese, there's only the imperative and the prohibitive left. And that shows there was more complexity in the earlier stage. And if we have time, I'll try to say something about why that might be the case. The imperative and the prohibitives are inflected forms that take part in a verb paradigm, which includes a number of other forms. It doesn't include tense. Tense is shown in a, well, actually Old Japanese is probably a tenseless language, but you can express tense optionally, but that's shown by inflecting suffixes that you can attach to the verb, not by the core inflectional paradigm. The prohibitives are formed differently. They take a verb form that we usually call the infinitive and then use this negative adverb before the verb, and sometimes reinforce that with the so or sone after it. Or there's a negative prohibitive particle after the verb. I'm not going to talk about this. I'll just say that I've elsewhere argued that this form is probably derived from this form when the na before the verb was interpreted as a grammatical element rather than an adverb. It then switched position, because that's where grammatical elements go in Japanese. So I'm not going to talk about these forms at all. I'll just mention that they're there. The next slide gives an overview, which again, I won't really go into, but it's just there for reference over what the forms look like with different kinds of verbs. Old Japanese, like modern Japanese, has two main verb classes: verbs where the stem ends in a consonant and verbs where the stem ends in a vowel. And for consonants, there's an inflectional ending ye, which after some consonants is just realized as simply because of phonotactic constraints on distribution of ye. With vowel-based verbs, the way of expressing the infinitive is usually just to, well, not usually, but originally just to use the stem of the verb, which makes a lot of sense. That's how imperatives are expressed in many languages. So no modification, just the bare stem. Or it can be used with an attached vocative particle, which is also used in other cases. And that is how the forms then continue into the later stages of the language with this vocative particle attached. There's a single irregular verb, which I'll just include because we'll see it a few times, core to come. We've already seen that. And that's the stem is core, and that's used as the imperative. So these three forms, they share a number of features which are not shared with declaratives and interrogatives. And that's one syntactic way of understanding that they actually form a set and that they express a mood, which we can at least now call the imperative mood, because it's amongst others includes the imperative. They are not used in questions. And this may be trivial, but they're often translated into forms of later Japanese, which you can use in questions, and that obscures the fact that they actually have this property of you cannot use them in a question. They cannot be questioned, which, yes, you can't question an imperative or an optative if it really is mood forms of that kind. They're not used in focus constructions. So you can't, with these forms, say, "It is my beloved, I want to be a garment," which are expressed as focus construction. They're not used in relative clauses and nominalized clauses. The forms that express declaratives and interrogatives can be used in relative clauses, so you can have relative clauses with WH words in them, expressing questions. and they can be nominalized, but these forms cannot. They are also not used with tense marking of any kind, with modality marking of any kind, in addition to what they themselves express, and they're not used with negation, other than, of course, the prohibitive being a negative form. And these things, I think, are fairly typical of imperatives and other imperative mood forms in languages, but it shows that these forms are distinct from all the other forms that we find. So in that sense, they clearly make up a set of forms. Many instantiations, uses of these forms in the material we have an explicit addressee or subject. It's sometimes difficult to know whether we should call it a vocative, an addressee, or whether we should think of it as a subject, and we'll see examples where it's clearly one or the other. And in this slide, I've given some examples of that. The ferryman, take the boat across quickly. That seems very clearly to be a vocative addressee. Here we have right dislocated, or that's the example we saw earlier, right dislocated addressee. And here we have my empress, please don't worry, as long as I'm around, with the prohibitive. And here with one of the optative forms, may you, my great lord, rule for 7 generations. That means we can, even though we weren't there, we don't know the context of the text, we can, in many, many cases, reconstruct either from within the same sentence that the forms are used in, or from context earlier or later, but usually earlier in the same poem. Who is addressed and who is the subject of these forms. So getting into more detail with the imperatives and the prohibitives, or the imperative and the prohibitive. So these are just, this is the form we just saw. With the imperative, by far the most examples have a human addressee and subject and verbs. So in going through describing individual forms, I'll try to focus on 2 things. So who's the subject? What is the subject? And what kind of verb are we dealing with? Because that also seems, well, that does influence the meaning that the form has. Most have, with the imperative, have human addressee subject, which is not at all surprising, nor is it surprising that most of them have volitional verbs. Sometimes we have non-human addressees, mountain cuckoo, please sing. And again, it's not particularly surprising. And this verb can both mean to cry non-volitionally, but here clearly to sing, which is a volitional verb. That's very much what we expect of imperatives. We also have non-volitional verbs like get fat. And we don't probably think it's very surprising. You can say something like eat and get fat. In English, it's actually eat that's the main imperative. And of course, eat is a volitional verb. Here, eat is the subordinate verb. So here is get fat by eating something. We're probably not surprised, but it's certainly a non-volitional verb used in the imperative. And then we have things like this, where please be unchanged forever, like a rock, my precious lord, which is very non-volitional. So it's not the case that all imperatives have applied to volitional verbs. We also have inanimate subjects. We have things like may the willow trees grow into a forest quickly, where the willow tree is certainly not animate. And you can certainly imagine talking to a willow tree in poetry, but there's no particular reason, there's no indication that this should be a vocative rather than a subject. And grow is again, is not a volitional verb, right? We have some crimson foliage of autumn leaves. Please follow on quickly when the bush clover has scattered its leaves. It's a bit of a stretch to think of this as addressing the autumn leaves. And then we have here, we don't have an express subject, but it's in a series of poems that are about footprints of the Buddha carved onto a rock. May they remain forever in the imperative. And it's certainly not an address in the context of these poems to the footprints. So we see some variability with regards to both subjects, most of them are human or animate, but some are not, very clearly not. And with verbs, most of them are volitional, but some are clearly not. And it's very difficult to make a meaningful translation of this, which is one way of sort of checking what it means, which uses the imperative form in English. It actually has the kind of meaning that we normally would associate with an optative. Prohibitives are the same in the sense that they certainly have a number of instantiations with human or strongly animate subjects and volitional verbs, like this, like one we saw earlier, and this one here, don't let anybody else wear my clothes. But the proportion of those is smaller compared to the imperatives. And again, we probably would recognize that from English and other languages, that you can ask people not to do things that you wouldn't ask them to do. There's a number of instances which we don't find for the imperatives, verbs of yearning, loving, being sad, forgetting, and things like that. And we're not so surprised that you can say, don't forget, or don't yearn, my love. But it is different from having volitional verbs as the verbs. And we also have something which we do not find with the imperatives as such. Weather or natural phenomena verbs. So like as in the examples here, don't let a storm blow in the great sea. There's no addressee here. It's just a request that hope that the storm won't blow. Don't let there be a low tide. Don't let this night dawn. So that's a way of using these forms that we do not find at all to the same extent with imperatives, and which you can use let in English, but that's not much of an imperative. But it's difficult to think of these as prohibitive forms in the sense of there being an addressee involved. Something we find with both the imperative and the prohibitive is embedding. And I said earlier that there are a number of things that you can't do with them, and that they don't partake in. And normally, I think embedding would be one such thing. Oops. Yeah, so this is just repeating what that slide from earlier. There are two situations. One type of embedding is completely expected, namely that if you have reported speech, as here, of course, you can embed an imperative, say, somebody said, don't come, or here, as here, come back fast. That's entirely expected. What I think is less expected is that two other situations. One is arguments, a verb of praying, hoping, wishing, etc., where the thing that's being hoped, prayed, wished for is in the imperative form. And I think that's certainly not found as widely as using some other form. I hope that they'll come. Yeah, we don't in English say, I hope, come. And purpose adjunct for really quite a range of predicates. They're mainly found with prohibitives, but there are also some examples, sorry, with imperatives, but there are also some examples with prohibitives. Here's with verbs of praying. So praying to the gods of heaven and earth that my mother be safe. You can say that, but here we probably wouldn't interpret the be as an imperative, but rather as a kind of subjunctive, right? You can say praying that my wife wait for me without any trouble, without having any problems. So that's one kind of embedding situation. The other one I find more remarkable and interesting. You can say the carnations in the garden which my beloved planted so that I may long for her. So that's what I think syntacticians would call a non-controlled purpose construction, yeah? And I think that is a slightly unusual way of using imperatives in a language. There are many, well, I don't know very many languages, but of the very few I know, I don't think that is a way of using imperatives. Here, the moon must be shining so that I can see, so that I may see clearly. And I think that's an interesting way of using these, and something that I think links with what is the core meaning of them, and I hope I'll get to that. Now I'll turn to the, no, sorry, here's a few more examples. Not very different here. My intention of doing this is that my Lord will arrive safely, with no copula at the end, but simply taking the imperative sentence or clause and treating it as a normal predicate, and then with a complementizer at the end. And here's an example with the privative. Ducks are said to sleep together with their mate, brushing and interweaving their white feathers so that frost won't fall on their tails. Again, the meaning is of course fine, but I think it's unusual to use imperative or privative constructions to express that. Now we'll turn to the optatives. I mentioned there are three different ones by ending na, ne, and namu. And here's some examples of those. It's usually said that they refer to wishes. So the way it's usually phrased in reference books is that it's wishes about a first person, about a second person, and about a third person. And there certainly is a lot in that, but I think it's not, for one thing, it's not an exhaustive way of describing what these forms mean in those contexts. And it's also maybe not quite the right way of thinking about it in terms of wishes. Talk about them in turn. First, one that ends in namu. I think that is as close as we actually get to a real optative in Old Japanese. The forms all have third-person subjects. Almost all of the verbs are intransitive, and most are non-volitional. This one here is probably somewhat volitional. So I wish the bush wabbler would sing through the planted trees. So, but other than that, it's things like, I wish the night would be long, or I wish the clouds would have compassion and not obscure the moon. I wish tonight would end, I wish this night would dawn quickly. So that form is fairly straightforward. There are also not very many examples of it, and but they all follow this pattern, so that's probably how it was used. The form that ends in na, which is said to be first person, is more complex than just saying it's first person, because there are certainly two very distinct ways of using it. One is a first person singular subject. Almost all examples are volitional, or most examples, but there are some non-volitional as well. And what it means in that context is, I want to, or I wish to. So I too want to. Here we have two very similar examples with a transitive volitional verb and with an unaccusative non-volitional verb. So I wish to make the skirt of the hem of my skirt wet. The context in the field that made the leggings of my Lord wet. So, or here I want to get wet in the rain, in the light rain. I do know what I think. The word optative is not really what would normally describe this kind of situation. Of course, you could put the word wish into it, but it's really, I want to do something, I want to have something. The other situation is where the subject is first plus second person. So you could say an addressee inclusive first and second or first person. And in those meanings, they have, in those uses, the form has meanings like letters, and almost you can use that to explain the meaning in English in almost all of these instances. So, my dear friends, let's wear flower crowns. My companions, let's decorate our hair, having broken off flowers. Or let us bind together branches of pine tree. So they all have meanings that, we would normally call hortatives. But optative is not, you can force it and put in the word wish in the explanation of what it means, but it really is forcing it. It really means let's do something. They're all volitional, and that fits well with the hortative meaning. I think it's difficult to make a hortative meaning out of a non-volitional verb. Maybe you can say, let's get fat together, but the form that ends in ne occurs in a number of situations or circumstances. One is second person subject with volitional verbs. And we've seen this example before, may you spend today. You can translate as may you spend or please spend. And if you think about the difference, there actually is very, very little difference. And of course, we shouldn't judge what the Old Japanese means in terms of how we translate it into English, but the translations are a way of thinking about what it means. We have examples where it's very difficult to put anything into the understanding of this than an imperative. So please come or come and help us. Wave your white sleeve, please wave your white sleeve as a sort of goodbye when you leave. Another example, my great Lord, may you rule for 7 generations, or please rule for 7 generations. It's difficult to judge, but it's also found with non-volitional verbs like stay as you are. May you stay as you are, please stay as you are. But that is really much closer to a wish about something than it is to, to the imperative meaning that we kind of find here. And I think for that reason, no, sorry, a few more. You can have third person subjects, which is different from what you expect of an optative that is supposed to have a second person subject. So there are clearly cases where that doesn't work. May the white clouds grant us rain. May the white azalea rub off on my clothes. It's not addressed to the white azalea or to the clouds. So I'll get to some kind of summary soon, but just summarizing for this particular form, I think it's very clear that it's functionally like the imperative. The imperative does exactly what I've just described. Well, I did describe that for the imperative, but as this form does, it can have, in many cases, a second person subject with a volitional verb, but it can also have a second person subject with a non-volitional verb or a third person subject with a non-volitional verb. And they are different meanings, but the imperative and this form share exactly that distribution and that range of meanings and usages. So coming to a summary, I've made this, not very good at making things on a computer, but what this is meant to, oops. Okay, we'll just wait for it to come back. What this is meant to show is a grouping of the forms and the label they're given. So the imperative, optative, and prohibitive, I think, if you remember what I said, but I'll summarize it now, they actually share the same kind of distribution and mapping of speaker, addressee, and third person onto the subject of the form that the verb occurs in, and the same distribution of volitionality of verbs. And then the na optative and the namu optative. So I still call this the ne optative because that's the traditional label. But I think if we consider the distribution of subjects and of verbs, all of these 3 forms can occur with second person subjects and third person subjects. They can occur when it's a second person subject with volitional verbs or with non-volitional verbs, and when it's a third person subject with non-volitional verbs. That's very clear. In terms of I call it meaning here, but still use these labels that we use for grammatical categories, but in lowercase and with a sort of some verbs put in to show how you can think of that meaning. When these three forms are used with a second person subject and a volitional verb, they mean what we associate with imperatives. I order, urge, advise, request that you do something. When then used with non-volitional second person subjects or with third person subjects, which are always have volitional verbs, they are really optative in meaning. So they mean I wish something is the case. The optative na can be used with first person singular subjects, meaning what we associate, I think, with the desiderative, but at least with the label desiderative, want to, wish to, will do something, or with an inclusive first second person subject with volitional verbs. Here it can be volitional or non-volitional. Here it has to be a volitional verb, and then it really has the meaning of a hortative. Let us do something, encourage us to do something. And then probably the most straightforward one is the optative that ends in namu, which always has third person subjects and it has almost always non-volitional verbs, and it has the meaning of an optative. I wish that something be the case. In short, I think that what determines which of these meanings obtain is a result of what's the subject. So how is the three things, the two or three things that could be involved, a subject, speaker, addressee, or third person entity, how are they mapped onto the verbs? And that's determined by these regularities. And is the verb then volitional or non-volitional? And that is what gives us whether this means do something, or I request that you do something, or I wish that something would happen. And so I try to come up with a core meaning of all of the forms, which so we don't have to think about other things than the subject and the volitionality of the verb. And that is that, I know this is connotative self-contained complements is a nonsensical phrase because complements can't be self-contained because they're complements of something. But the point is that for imperative forms and for these forms that we're considering here, the verb form in itself governs the complement and is the complement. And they actually have a very, very, in that sense, complex, both semantic and well, maybe not overtly syntactic, but they have a very complex structure. So I order that something, or I request that something, and then the something is expressed by the same verb that the I order is expressed on. So it's actually a 2-in-1, and that's why I thought this phrase could explain that intuition. I'm sure that if you're a syntactician or semanticist, you would say you can't say this. Please don't say that. But it is meant to capture that double role of the verb. And connotative, I think, is a much nicer verb than directive or imperative or any of the other verbs that people use. And I'll explain why in a second. But the structure that this occurs in is not just this. It occurs in this kind of semantic structure that there is always, of course, a speaker involved, as any utterance has an addressee. And then there is what we can put in of meanings, not expressed by a verb, but what we can put in by meanings that is realized in here. And these meanings are, I think, can be described as being automatically, semi-automatically derived from the distribution of subjects and volitionality of verbs. And so this is the core meaning, that something be the case. But of course, there has to be someone who says it, and someone it's addressed to, and something it's about. And if that something it's if that's something it's about, the subject of the predication that is hoped to be the case is the speaker, then we get one kind of meaning. If it's the addressee, we get another kind of meaning. Or if it's a third person, we get another kind of meaning, again, depending on the volitionality of the predicate. Do I have time for a little bit more?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's what so I should say I've never spoken on this before. I took it on because I thought it would be really interesting to look at. So it's a kind of early stage in my attempt to figure out what is going on. But I think there certainly is something in this. I will say a couple more things. One is that something be the case in a main clause use. That's sort of semantically what it looks like. But remember, we also had these embedded situations where that something be the case is embedded as a real complement. Maybe trivially in some cases, but certainly not trivially in all cases. There's nothing to say that you need to use an imperative in this kind or a prohibitive in this kind of context to express this. But what this means is that something be the case. That something being that that frost doesn't fall on the tails. And that's divorced from the main clause use, but it still has the same core meaning, that something be the case. So changing track, I just also wanted to point out some sort of morphological connections between these forms. Those of you who are morphologically inclined will have noticed some of this already. But these are the forms that express these different categories. First of all, the prohibitive has this so at the end, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a fossilized root or stem form of the verb to do. And that is the same way that you express imperatives of verbs that end in a vowel. So that conforms completely to that. So this is, in a sense, an imperative in a negative context. The ne that we find in some of the imperatives is identical to the so-called optative that ends in ne. So they are actually morphologically very clearly related, and that supports well the idea that the optative belongs in this, the optative ne belongs in this set of forms. And of course, both the imperative, this ne here, the and this ends in the same vowel. So that is morphologically the same expression, which again ties them together as one set. However, it's also clear that these three forms morphologically go together in that they attach to the same stem of consonant verbs and they have an N initially in the ending. And so that, I think, etymologically suggests that at some point these must have formed a very clear set where functionally now the relation is more like that. When I say now, I mean at the old Japanese stage. And maybe if we think of that in terms of the diachrony of this, that this is the development, this is the situation, the forms we have in Old Japanese, these are the forms we have in Middle Japanese, and then in Modern Japanese. At some point, this could have been a complete set to express everything apart from the negative imperative that here now also is expressed by the imperative form. If the imperative and this optative and ne basically mean the same thing, it means that they are in competition in some way. And that can, one way of interpreting that diachronically is that one is replacing the other. There are other ways of interpreting it, of course, but it is, I think, remarkable that these three forms share so much in the form, but are very different in their usage, or rather they have differentiated uses depending on the endings. The ending here we can certainly recover as an imperative. There's no way of recovering what this ah might mean or the amu might mean. It doesn't look like anything else much in Japanese morphology. So one way of understanding what has happened is that this set is somehow a competing set with the imperative set, or the imperative form, which, by the way, is by far the most robust verb form in the history of the Japanese language. It has not changed apart from a little bit of phonological change, whereas a lot of other things have happened to verb forms in the course of the history of the language. So I'll leave it there. But I think these different morphological relations between the forms suggest that something has happened. Some of the meanings expressed by this na optative are expressed by non-mood forms later, modal forms, but not a separate mood. And the same for this one, the wishing meaning. You can, of course, wish things in modern Japanese as well, but they're not expressed by separate mood forms. So we have a mood system here that is in some stage of transition, and maybe we'll someday find out from what. I'm not in a position to say that now, but it certainly transitions to something really quite different and far simpler. And I think I'll stop here. I'm probably also out of time, also out of town compared to where I usually spend my time. So I know this is a little bit inconclusive, but I hope that there's something to talk about in the questions. Thank you very much.